using and configuring 8021X and deploying that with the Casper Suite. We will have Andy and Jean from the Hopkins School here to present on that.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. How are you? Great. All right. So this is deploying 8021X Radius for, with the Casper Suite. Oop. So I'm Andy Hakala. This is my colleague Jean Stanilevsky. And we're system administrators for Hopkins Public Schools. We have a lot of Macs, a lot of iOS devices, and a lot of Windows computers. So when we went into this, we had to find a solution that was going to work for all of our devices and also work for devices being brought into the school because kids are bringing their own devices and we may want to get them on our network. So we'll start, we'll talk a little bit about installing and configuring what's called a network policy server with Windows Server. We'll look at configuring wireless access points, setting up a client policy within network policy server, and also a policy to deploy it with the Casper Suite, and then we will let it loose on the network. And at the end, we'll take questions at the end, discussion. If you guys are using 8021X and have comments or want to share anything, that's great. So the conditions for our environment, we're using Active Directory, Windows 2008 R2. We've got a 2008 R2 network policy server, or Radius, Windows Radius. And we have 10.6 or higher clients. This will also work with 10.5, 10.4 clients. It's a little bit different. 10.4, we couldn't push the policy to, right? There was a little more manual configuration with 10.4. So why we chose this solution, again, it integrated with our existing Active Directory. It was fairly simple to roll out. I think it took us about a month to really get things working right in our lab environment, and then we could just easily roll that into production. And it's extendable, so if down the road we want to do things with security using Microsoft security products and do further network filtering right at the Radius server, we certainly can do that. We don't have any plans to do that, but it's definitely a possibility. So just a quick rundown of what our network looks like. Down on the bottom, those would be clients. And by clients, those are actually access points, not end-user clients. So the green lines, we have two SSIDs. One of them is a guest network that requires no authentication. The other is the network that's secured by Radius. So you'll notice that the green lines hit a wireless controller, and they go straight to the firewall and out to the internet. They don't touch any of our other hardware. If they are going to an internal site, it has to be a site that's available publicly. So they'll go out the firewall, hit the internet, and come back and see it as a public site and not as a private IP. If you're a client trying to authenticate, it's the yellow traffic. So you'll go from your access point to a wireless controller to the Radius server, back around, get your authentication, and then you can touch everything as if you're on the secured network. You'll see our cores have a cloud around them, as well as our firewall. That's just to show redundancy. Those are essentially cloud devices. It's a cluster. One of them can fail. Everything still works as normal, hopefully. So the basic configuration on the server side, start with a Windows 2008 R2 server. Open up the server manager box and click on Add Network Policy Server Services. It'll take, you'll click yes a bunch of times at the end. It'll tell you to reboot, and then you've got it ready to go. Then you configure your Radius-specific things. We'll have some screenshots later and talk about individual settings. And then at the very end, you'll add your APs and controllers. Everything should go right through. If you're working with a wireless vendor, it's going to be a little different for each wireless device. One thing that we noticed is that our wireless vendor got a little disappointed because really all you do is you click a box on your controller that says, we're not going to use any features and we're passing all the authentication off to Windows. So you pretty much turn it into a pass-through so they don't get to do any other fancy filtering or anything like that right at the AP. So it's sort of a bummer for them. Server side, Some great resources for learning how to configure this stuff and learning about the options. The Microsoft certified, the technical guide, it's the exam kit 70-642. This is the one for 2008 R2. I don't know if it has the same number with the 2013 products, but if you go on Amazon, I bet you could buy this for about $8 right now. Totally worth the money, or you could probably go find the same article online for free. This is, the title is Windows Server Networking Guide from Microsoft Press. Another great one is just an article called Using Windows 2008 for Radius. And it was written by a guy named Tobias Rice. I happened to find it through Google. And the URL is right there, so when they post this to the Taptera app, you can just click on that or type that link in. There's some other really good articles on that site, but this particular one is kind of a step 1 through 20 on how to configure network policy services for Windows. Quick configuration tips. With network policy server, you want to start really simple. Sorry, I missed a slide there. We'll see if we can get back to it. So I would recommend, you'll get into network policy server and there's going to be a ton of options. There's going to be all this stuff about integrating, your client has to be at a certain antivirus level to get on the network and everything like that. I would recommend skipping over all of that. Start with something really basic where you have, they have to be a member of this security group or they have to be a member of this computer group, and just get the thing to work before you start trying to add a bunch of spicy ingredients that are going to add or allow certain users. With the access points and controllers, it's going to be really important to know your product and know that your product actually supports 802.1x. Most things will now. When we were looking at our network, I don't think that was definitely the case. I think that there were definitely some controllers out there that didn't support it. There was also some hardware, like if you had Windows 7 Home Basic, you couldn't get on an 802.1x network. So just things like that. And then make sure that your devices, your actual controllers or access points are pointed back at your Radius server for authentication and not trying to authenticate themselves, because otherwise they have to have a local user database or something like that. This is a just sample screen. It's a little hard to see here, but you'll see up on the top row, that's where you would point it. This is off of Extreme Networks wireless controller. Which version, Gene?
Version 5.4.
Okay, so version 5.4. I think there might even be a newer version out now than that.
5.4 dot something.
Great.
Yeah, but this is.
So the top is where you'd put your IP address in this. The port is going to be default. I think everything else in there is pretty much a default value. The big thing is you've got a shared secret. When you're setting up your network policy server, it's going to say, what do you want your shared secret to be? We chose just a long string and saved it in a document somewhere so we can later add stuff through it. But that's kind of the secret handshake of how all this stuff will be allowed to join together. On the server side, the biggest hiccup we ran into was working with certificates. Some of you are probably experts with certificates. I'm not. We learned about certificate authorities through this process, and it's pretty complicated. The biggest thing that we learned is that you can use a wildcard certificate. So if you have we have one through DigiCert, that's a star.hopkinsschools.org. And we got it to work. What we had to do was agree to have a certificate nag. So your iPads and your Macs will say, are you sure you want to trust this certificate? Because it doesn't have the full name. And on the Windows side, we had to uncheck a box that said, make sure all root certificates are fully verified. And that's because in the wildcard, the chaining doesn't work quite right as far as Windows Radius is concerned. An alternative would be to run an internal certificate authority. And we looked at that, but that's a lot more complicated. So we're fine with just having a, pre-trusting a certificate or something like that. And then follow the instructions. There's a really specific set of instructions for how to add these certificates, and if you think that you cannot follow them, maybe it'll work, I don't know. But we found that when we didn't follow the instructions, it didn't work. When we did, it started working. And then when you get into conditions, this is the last thing. This is what I was talking about with starting small. There's a sample screen coming up, And start small, use only what's required. That's kind of my advice on it. So this is a basic conditions that we use. You'll see that they just have to be a part of the domain computers group, or the user has to be in the security group called wireless users. And what we've done for that is any student, any staff member are in the wireless users group. So if a student brings their iPhone and they want to connect to our secured network, we're just fine with that. They're using their username and password. It's all logged. If they're doing weird things on the network, we can get their IP address, get their MAC address, and track them down to what room they're in. So we're not too worried about what's going to happen there. When you get to the constraint screen, this is where you configure what's going to, or how the connection's going to be made. You'll see we're using Microsoft Protected EAP or PEEP and MS Chat v2. These options that we chose are kind of the standard, and we took these on the advice from somebody in the Apple Enterprise department. But the big thing here is that you just want to make sure on the client side you're configuring the client to look like the screen looks. There's going to be all the same options on the client side, just check the same boxes. Or in your policy that you set up in, as you'll see later, the policy you set up in Casper, you'll check the same boxes. So some gotchas with this on the server side. If you want to do 802.11 AC, then you'll have to use server 2013 R2. I haven't done a lot of work with that server yet. I quickly, when we started preparing for this presentation, I went out and read the release notes. That's the biggest change that I saw between 2008 R2 and the 2013 version of Network Policy Server is that it supports the AC protocol. And again, wildcard certs will work. It's probably better to use a real, a full certificate authority, but for us, wildcard meets our needs. So I'm going to pass it over to Gene, and we'll talk a little bit about configuring the client side for iOS and 10.7.
So once you have your NPS server configured, you've got your wireless devices, access points or controllers defined, you've got your protocol set up. Now we can start inputting that information into the controller, which Andy had a previous slide on that, and into the JSS. So I'm going to walk through several different scenarios that we have for Mac OS X, iOS, and carts versus one-to-ones. This is an OS X configuration profile for 10.7, 10.8 clients. Basically, we start with a new configuration profile. The first thing that I like to do is I like to install or import our certificate first, and I'll show you why I do that. So Andy mentioned that we use DigiCert wildcard certificate. Just go out to their site, download the certificate, import it. You'll notice that there are some requirements as far as what the extension needs to be for the certificate. The next thing is we're going to create a network payload. We're going to use the same authentication type, pre-shared key, everything from the NPS server. So we're using PEEP. In our environment for configuration profiles, we're using auto-join. And so the username that you see there on the bottom and the password, that's the wireless user defined by the Active Directory. So this is our generic user that's used on the one-to-one, or sorry, not on the carts. And this is the one that we can also track this using NPS's security logs.
And the reason we chose to use to preload a user there rather than having the users sign on themselves. In the carts, this would be in an elementary school, and we didn't want to have a second grader, when they opened up the laptop, have to type in username and password, know to put domain/username, Just avoids a lot of conversations. So these computers will auto-join to the network, and we're not too concerned at that age group of doing that.
Yeah, and so the way this works, this is scoped to all of our Intel 10.7, 10.8 clients. So as soon as we're done imaging, this profile gets applied as part of the post-flight script. So as soon as they're connected to or connected to the JSS, this is one of the profiles that gets applied to the client. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the trust button there. And the reason I went with the certificate first is if I don't upload the certificate, then I don't have any trusted certificate in this window. So I have to go out to the certificate tab, upload the certificate, and come back to the network payload. So this way, we're kind of doing everything in line. You're going to see your certificate there. Basically, just put a check mark for the certificate that you're going to trust. This is the DigiCert wildcard certificate. And now we're going to scope this. Like I said, we're scoping this to all Intel 10.7 and 10.8 computers, with some exceptions like cards. And on the iOS side, exception would be our one-to-one iPads. And that's it. Like I said, this is part of our workflow for imaging, so it gets applied as part of the post-flight script. For 10.6, it's a little bit different. We have a package in the JSS with a certificate and a package, a DMG. The DMG has the certificate, and we also have a script that runs a network setup command that installs that script and trusts that script, so that on a 10.6 client, you get a system profile in System Preferences Network. So this is the network profile for 10.6 clients. And I think we'll have a little sample of our script there. So in this script, the best way that we found to apply the script is to turn off the airport, and that's the network setup command, the first one. Then we in the DMG, we put our network connect profile into a hidden folder, and that the second network setup command basically installs that or imports that profile. Once it's done, we remove the profile from the temp directory and turn the airport back on. So this will create the system profile on the 10.6 client. And the reason we're going with the system profile is so that the computers can sit at a login screen, and we can still communicate with the computer from the JSS or from ARD or whatever. And this is what a 10.6 client looks like when everything is done, when the package is applied and the script has finished running. You can see that we're using the same wireless user, same authentication that we've got set up on the NPS server. We're defining the wireless network. That's our Hopkins net is our SSID for 802.1x. And WPA is the protocol type. I'm actually going to go back here once. So the network setup command that we use in this script was introduced in 10.5, but I haven't had much luck running the same script on a 10.5 computer client. And actually, since we don't have any 10.5 clients anymore, we haven't spent too much time troubleshooting that, but it can work. As Andy mentioned that you can use this in 10.4. We only have a handful of 10.4 clients, so every setup that we've done on a 10.4 was manual setup through Internet Connect application. It does support 802.1x.
There's no system profile, though, with 10.4.
Right. If you want to use it as a system profile, the client has to be joined to your OD. But in our environment, that was not an option. So these are OS 10 clients. Now on the iPad side or iOS side, we've got a similar profile as we have for 10.7, 10.8 clients. Everything is the same, username, protocols, all that stuff is the same. Again, as soon as students, so let's say this is for our one-to-one deployment, students would enroll over the air, and as soon as they enroll, they get the profile on their iPad. For our carts, we use Apple Configurator, and we have a similar policy or a profile that gets applied as we're supervising our iPads. So for one-to-one, again, because students are enrolling using their own credentials, we have a better way of tracking their devices through either NPS logging or through Extreme Networks, basically looking up a MAC address or whatever, IP or MAC address if we know that information. And the JSS can provide that by just looking up a report for a device. Let's say a device went missing. We can just look up a device by username, and JSS will give us that information. So that's it for our presentation. Do you have any questions? Yes?
What made you guys choose to use a post-flight script to set up the 10.7, 10.8 clients instead of using just a push notification like you were doing with the self-enrolled iOS devices?
So basically, it's done the post-flight script, but what I meant by that is that it runs when the JSS runs that post-flight script, or the client runs the post-flight script, that's when the profile gets pushed out to the client. So it's done through a push notification.
It triggers a push.
Yes?
So on the Mac side, you've got them joined to Active Directory, and then you're trying to use computer level or device level authentication?
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't have any luck with that on the Macs. We're doing something like that on the Windows side, but the way that what I've seen in Active Directory is the way that that Macs and Unix computers, when they join, it's there's something with Kerberos in there that doesn't always work quite right. And I'm sorry, I can't give you a more specific answer, but yeah, we noticed the same thing. It didn't work right, which is why we're using the system profile instead of computer authentication, because there's a whole thing you're supposed to be able to do where when it's at the login, it's using computer authentication, and then when a user logs in, it rolls over to user-based authentication based on a Kerberized send of that information. But we're not doing that. There are some school districts that do.
The other question I had was, we've experienced that we managed to get the computer authentication to work, but especially when Mac goes to sleep, when you wake it up, it'll, after like a minute, it'll drop the connection and then reconnect, and then it starts repeating, and it started to become a bit of a headache.
Absolutely, yeah. We saw the same thing. I think with the 10.4 machines, because that was when so what would happen is it would keep trying to re-authenticate, and then our Radius server would get flooded with connection requests, and then people legitimately trying to join the network at a user level couldn't, which is, I think, another reason that we just went with the system profile instead of the computer level, because the networking The wireless connection, I believe, does go to sleep when the computer goes to sleep, and then when it wakes back up, it's not a graceful reconnection. Yeah. Blue shirt.
We have almost this exact same setup running, except that we are using the computer credentials to authenticate. In the config profile, we just have all computer names put in for the username part.
Oh.
And the password's left blank, and it does authenticate with the AD computer record at that point.
Oh, sweet.
But we see the exact same issue you're talking about with the 60-second drop. Ever since NA4 came out, NA4 and NA5, we've seen that issue. Anything 10.7 up through 10.8.3, haven't seen the issue. Case open happening on it as we speak.
Great. Great. There was a question down here, too. Yeah.
I may have missed it, but do you handle your faculty and staff the same way as students? So you're not necessarily having them authenticate?
Staff, we've got, for staff, we have a profile versus students. We have students authenticating using their own credentials. We're thinking about going away and having our staff also sign in using their own credentials, just so for tracking purposes, I guess, accountability and stuff.
Part of our decision to have the username and password pre-populated was based on the fact that we were deploying the network right as staff were coming back in the fall. And one of the things we didn't really talk about is when we rolled this network out, we rolled it out over an existing wireless network. So we had 3 SSIDs. We had a guest, we had a Hopkins net, and we had each school had their own existing wireless network. So then we used the existing wireless network to roll them over onto Hopkins net, but we wanted to do it silently so no one could complain about the overhead of having to type more passwords, more usernames and passwords, or say, oh my gosh, it's asking me for a username and password, what do I put in? So this, having it pre-populated just allowed us to do a silent rollover for the most part.
So do you handle access or permissions in Active Directory after the fact? I'm just not sure how that, as far as groups.
Oh, how they get in the group? Yeah. So we have a whole system of provisioning the users when they come in. So to be in that wireless users group is what group they have to be in to use the wireless network. So when a new staff is hired, they get put into a security group for the building they're in. And then all of those buildings are members of the wireless security group. And the students are also in like a high school student, junior high student, that type of security group. And they are also in those groups are all added to the wireless user group. So if we wanted to do, like if a student, for behavior reasons or whatever, we wanted to take away their wireless access, one of the things we've talked about and would be fairly easy to do is add another variable into that conditions, where if they're a member of the discipline group, then they wouldn't be able to use the network, or they'd have limited network access, like maybe no internet, but they could access internal services or something like that. We've briefly talked about it, but not really made any moves on that.
Orange shirt there in the back.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you answered this. Your Macs are members of the domain, is that correct?
No.
They're not.
We're not joining them to the domain.
Okay. And then I guess just we're using Cisco ICE and Cisco wireless devices, and we actually ran into the computer off problem that you're talking about. And what we did was we were using Windows to issue the certs, and there's an option to choose a 2003 compatible cert, and that actually worked for us in the 2008 and up would not. So just one of those things. And then
Yep.
for the Radius thing on the Cisco side, you can actually tweak those settings and make Radius not so chatty. I don't know about on the Windows side.
There was a setting in the Extreme controller too about how many times to try and how often to try as well. We just left that default.
Right. You might, I mean, if that's a problem, you might want
Yeah.
to try playing with that.
Yeah, excellent.
Right there in the front.
So also using computer authentication and seeing the 60-second drops for Apple finally made it that's fixed in Mavericks. So they weren't going to fix it anymore. They finally admitted to it. So for those who are seeing the 60-second drops, we are running a couple releases of Mavericks, and we haven't seen that drop happen yet. So.
That's great.
Okay.
What do you do with BYOD devices that come in? Do they stay on that guest network, or are they're members of the AD group and they log into your secure network with the BYOD?
If they can log in using their own AD credentials, we're not blocking anything on their own devices.
It took kids about a day and a half to figure out to figure out what settings they needed to have to get on the 802.1x network, and that they could use their username and password to do it. And we didn't want to stop that. I mean, it's like, well, they're bringing a device in and they're putting their name on it. So there we go.
And that's for Windows and Mac?
Windows and Mac, yeah. The Windows settings are a little harder for the kids to figure out because they bury some of the menus within menus. But on the Mac or an Android device, when you pick the Radius network, I think my latest Android actually pre-populated everything except the part where about MS Chat V2.
And so since you're using a public cert on that, they don't have to have your internal domain cert on their personal device ahead of time.
They get a warning. That's where you get the warning that says this, this certificate isn't verified because it doesn't have the full chain. It has a wildcard. And if they, then they have to accept it, or if they don't want to, then they don't get on the network.
This is more of an NPS question, but
Sure.
how often does it pull members of the AD groups to like move a student out of the group? Does it only come off after they re-authenticate, or is it serverless time?
It seems to happen, yeah, it's either, so we haven't monitored adding and removing from that group, but I can tell you when I change my password, it's a Kerberos timeout. So I changed my password a couple days ago, and my phone was working fine, and then yesterday it dropped offline when I was in the office for about 20 minutes. So it seems to be, I think our session timeout right now is 8 hours. So probably about a work day.
Right here.
You guys tried doing JSS to pre-populate, or using JSS to pre-populate the username and password for the user authentication at whatever JSS has for the variable?
No. We use that for other features. Email, for example, is one of them, but we have never tried for 802.1x authentication. No, yeah, that's an interesting idea, but we've never tried that.
And with that one there, definitely reach out to your support rep. It's something that we may be able to help with.
You could, there's a session later about UI in a Unix world. So I could see if you took that network setup script and wrote your own little UI about it, you might be able to do something like that. I could see that working.
Right here.
We've tried to do that in the past. So we generally tell people if it has hopkinsschools.org in the name, go ahead and take it. For a long time, a lot of our internal websites threw cert warnings when you went to them because we were using a lot of self-signed certificates. We've gotten away from that, but at that time, we were doing some education about cert warnings, but we don't really do a great job in that regard. If it's a place, if you're going to a place and you know where you're going and you get offered that warning, my rule of thumb is take it with some, read it read everything and then decide if you want to accept it. But if you just get that warning randomly, read it and probably don't take it. That's what I would tell people, but that's not something that our users have a lot of time for. I think it's a great topic, but I don't think our users would agree.
Thought there was another question up in the top here. No? Right here. No, we don't. We just have one Radius server. We are replicating that, so we're using, it's a virtual machine. We're using VMware's replication, so we're replicating at a 15-minute interval. So if we were to lose it, we could do a failover to our DR site. The whole process would take about 5 minutes. But I did some reading on high availability with Radius servers and network policy servers. And one of the interesting things is if you're running 2 of them, they don't load balance. Or at least that I found. And maybe that's a feature. Maybe you can cluster them in 2013. I don't know. But the people that are doing that, it's a pretty, it seems like bubblegum and duct tape. Like it doesn't seem like something that Microsoft would support if we went back to them and said, here's what we're trying to do. And that, so far it's been fine. I mean, it's a virtual machine. We've got 3 ESX hosts on the primary site and 2 on the other. Everything is networked back into 2 cores. So we can lose a lot of things before that particular server is going to go. So we're comfortable with that. But if there's somebody that is doing, that is managed to cluster them and do that, I would love to sit down and talk about that, because that's something we looked at. You're doing that? Oh, sorry. Yeah, so if somebody is doing it, find us afterwards, as I'd like to hear about it.
Maybe this is kind of a more open question, but when we set up Linux, we tried to, we had a lot of concerns about people hitting the little accept the certificate. There were a lot of people that just didn't want to have to do that, so we created a server cert from our CA. That we put on the devices, except what we encountered and what sort of bit us in the ass this summer was that certificate expired. So 5,000 iPads, 500 MacBooks later, after we sent that out again, we did it, and it was very fast and had to right away, but that certificate still said it was expired. And so what into like July of next year. So what I'm curious about is if anyone is doing it that way, where they send that out to devices, so we can extend that, or is there a better way just to?
Our certificate expired last year. We didn't catch it in time, so we didn't give our clients enough time to repopulate or get a new certificate. So our plan for next time is to renew our cert probably, I want to say maybe 2 months in advance, create a new profile, configuration profile, and push it out and give your clients enough time to get the new certificate. And when the expiration time comes, all you have to do, at least on the NPS in our environment, you just have to flip the certificates.
See, that's what I'm kind of curious about, is if you create a new one, and then you put in the configuration profile and distribute that.
Yep.
Something that, at least on the Macs, and I think on the iPad too, it's counted before, is that if we take off an old profile, even if another one is there, we take an old one off, it sort of rips away the authentication.
Right, you would create another profile with the certificate payload. And instead of adding your certificate payload to your existing profile, I would create another profile with the certificate, just the certificate payload, and upload your new certificate, and just let it sit there until your old one expires.
And then on the network policy side, too, you have two configurations there. You'd have, yeah, so where you saw we had the Hopkins Secure Wireless, it probably said, I think it said Hopkins Secure Wireless with new cert. It says that because we had one with an old cert, too. And so we had those ready to go, and then when it expired, we got rid of the old one and moved the new one to the top.
Okay, and then you just kind of, do you keep the old profile there on the devices then?
Well, since the old profile has the authentication, it kind of has to stay. Because if you add your payload, certificate payload to the existing profile and apply it to all existing devices, yeah, you're right. You're gonna lose your clients.
Right. Right. The other thing we did was this time around we renewed our certificate for 5 years.
Right.
And Gene and I banked on maybe we won't be working at Hopkins when it has to be done again. So. Right, yeah, or we won't even care. Yeah.
Any other questions? Right here in the front.
Did you happen to look at any other Radius solutions besides Microsoft?
Yeah, we looked a little bit at Freeradius, which is a great one. It's a little more complicated to set up. I looked at it again a little bit before this presentation, but I really don't know enough about it. Since we were already using Active Directory and we're a school, so we get Microsoft stuff really cheap. It was, we have data center licensing for all of our virtual hosts, so to spin off a 2008 server, it doesn't cost anything for us, or it costs very little. With the data center license, you have unlimited VMs. So it was really easy just to spin off another VM and add click a couple buttons. Whereas with Freeradius, I think there's a little more setup. There's some cool things you can do with accounting. I know talked to somebody at a university, they were using Freeradius, and then each student had the ability to enroll 5 devices. And when you got to the 5th device, it said, which device do you not want to use anymore? So there's some accounting. That way, if you're bringing 1 million devices, you can't put them all in the network, which we've actually seen. There's a huge amount of devices on our network, and we're not really sure. We have a lot of bandwidth and a lot of backbone, so it doesn't bother us too much, but in the real world, there's all kinds of networks that don't look like ours. So.
Up there in the top.
Well, that Windows, the Windows networking manual, they're really good about explaining all the different elements of it. And like I said, like you said, there's a ton of layers to it. We really zeroed in on what we're trying to do and sort of ignored the rest. So put on blinders and said, what we're trying to do here is authenticate computers with wireless access points. And there are a ton of other things you can do. I mean, what I learned through this is Radius was really designed as like a VPN technology. So it's really, the whole design of it is almost like you're VPNing into your own network, which was super cool. And it was really fun to learn all that stuff. But I really just kind of put the blinders on and said, what we're trying to do here is use Active Directory to let people onto a wireless network so we don't have to share a password. That was kind of the end goal. And that's kind of, when I kept saying, keep it simple. The other features, we have used our Radius server now. We authenticate to a couple different, we use it for like our UPSs and a couple of other network devices instead of just simple authentication. And it's good, but yeah, it's pretty complicated. The other nice thing about that series of Microsoft manuals is you get a cool little project to do. So you read about the technology a little bit, and then there's a lab. And they give you, when you buy those books, you get all the server products on a DVD that have a temporary license. And when that license expires, you just say, okay, it expired, and you get a new temporary license. So it's kind of a project-based learning. So if you're not a real school goer, you can buzz through it on your own time.
Right here.
Is there anybody doing 802.1x for wired connection? Discuss.
Yeah, I'll let these guys talk about it.
Well, our implementation, we actually have two separate CAs for one for wireless settings and one for Wi-Fi. So effectively, all our endpoints have two certificates. One's used to authenticate, and there's I think like 3 or 4 root CAs, and then 2 intermediaries. So it keeps all of the certs in the chain. And if you miss one, you're gonna have a problem. So like the big thing, I would say for wireless law, make sure you have all your certs. And in your cert template, the big thing is make sure you use NT principal name, not because there's like 4 settings when it generates a cert. I think 30 letters NT principal name. Use any others, you're gonna have you have issues
Was everybody able to hear that all right? No. Let me.
You don't want to summarize that?
Hot mic coming at you.
So the way we implemented Wired 802.1x, we actually had 2 separate infrastructures. One, we got a certificate issued to the wired network, and the other one for the wireless. Big things that we've noticed when we did that is, one, the certificate template is important. You have to use the, I believe, the NT principal name instead of whatever default in the certificate template that Microsoft gives you. Otherwise, the machine won't properly authenticate. And the other thing is when you do your mobile config, you have to include every single one of your root and intermediary certificates. If you miss one of them, you're going to have an issue authenticating. So all that stuff, and it's a real pain in the neck, because for me, like doing the mobile config, I think I had to put like 7 or 8 different certificates in it. And I mean, it's a tedious process. But you know, if you do something smart, like have like 5-year renewals, or I think we have 10 for your servers, it shouldn't be an issue.
And I think, I don't know a ton about the Windows CA server, but I think in the CA server you can configure how long your certificates last as well. So if you wanted to do a 5-year, if you're running your own certificate authority with Windows, I believe you can set that to be 5 years. I'm not positive there.
So I was assisting a client with doing 802.1x wired and wireless with AD binding. And one of the sort of interesting things that we ran into was that there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem with automatic enrollment, because you can't, unless you've got your 802.1x already set up at the machine level, you can't connect to the AD controllers or get the certificate to do the machine authentication to the 802.1x. So we actually had to segment off a special network segment to do the Casper imaging, so that they could unauthenticated and talk to the domain controllers. And it was just one of those, you know, why isn't this working? It works if we don't do the 802.1x, and if we turn it on, it doesn't work. And you're kind of having to trace through all those steps carefully, and then realize, oh, duh.
We also ran into that as well. You have to have separate provisioning areas for your computers. One workaround that we are testing is you can have a remediation network, so it'll dump you onto a separate network to have that computer. So you can still find it and whatever you got to do, and then still pull it that if you need network authentication.
Yeah, we did have to, we were able to do it at that level with large corporations, and it moved kind of slow.
Yeah, I think in the network policy server too, I think you can, like if your client doesn't meet a certain requirement, you can tell it, put them onto this network instead. I don't know how that would work though with imaging and with like pixie booting and stuff. That was kind of our concern with the wired, and then we also wanted to have a fallback network for when we broke everything. You know, just in case if this doesn't work, what can we have people do to be able to, like you said, get the certificates and get the policies, which are fallback. If things stop working, we tell them to plug into a wire, and then we can do a recon, or we can do a push notification or something like that to help get them back wireless.
All right, well, thank you everyone for attending. I'll be posting a Jamf Nation article and encourage everybody to continue the discussion offline, ask any questions on there, and we'll have information regarding this presentation and the slide deck up there as well. Thank you again. Thanks, Andy and Gene.
Thanks.